Things are getting weirder of late, and it seems that horror cinema has once again delivered the goods when it comes to blurring the lines between sense and nonsensical madness. The thing is, the term weird is a fine line when it comes to horror cinema. Sometimes you may watch a movie that doesn't quite fit within any given convention and think, well, I'm not entirely sure what I should think. And other times you'll watch a weird movie that lingers so far outside of the conventional box of horrors and think, hey, this is a flavour that I could get used to. In part one of this list we covered a few tongue-in-cheek classics, but this time we're gonna get even weirder, so hold on to something. Hello horror fans, what's going on? And once again welcome back to the Scary channel on YouTube, top 5 scary videos. As per usual, I'll be your horror host Jack Finches. Today we curiously take a look at the top 5 weirdest horror movies of all time, part 2. Roll the clip. Wow. Okay, for the curious amongst you, that clip was from 1978's Attack of the Killer Tomatoes, which certainly hits all the boxes when it comes to weird horror movies of all time, given the fact that it's a horror movie, an absolutely batshit insane psychological thriller, a comedy that could give Airplane a run for its money in places, and well, it's a musical too. Yeah. You want weird? Watch that movie. But like I said in the intro, we're going to take weird to a whole new place in this part 2. And murderous, ambiguous fruit vegetables are off the table from now on. Honourable mention, done. Kicking off at number 5, Neon Maniacs, 1986. Alright. Before we get too serious, we'll kick things off with an old dose of pure oddness that doesn't make any sense because it doesn't have to, because it was acceptable in the 80s. The thing is, this film could not have been made today or in any other era for that matter. In fact, it had to be a product of the 80s because this film is the bizarre, unverified residue that would leak out of the debris if you put the entire decade of the 80s in one of those car-crushing compactor things and let it to rot for a few weeks. Neon Maniacs, a film that doesn't make any sense, but bizarrely enough, despite trying not to be in places, is also thoroughly entertaining, whilst having a few moments of genuinely creative moments in horror. For those that haven't yet seen Neon Maniacs, you're going to need a little bit of context to understand the extent of its appeal, if that's the word, but as far as weirdness goes, it kind of speaks for itself. Imagine if the Power Rangers travelled back in time half a decade and made a string of terrible life choices, and then met up with the Cenobites, and then somehow accidentally stumbled upon the set of Nightbreed after having a brief stint on Nightmare on Elm Street. That's the Neon Maniacs, the horde of horror monstrosities that never were. Directed by Joseph Mangine and written by Mark Patrick Carducci, Neon Maniacs, which was also released briefly under the title Evil Dead Warriors, tells a tale of a legion of strange demonic entities that live beneath the Golden Gate Bridge in San Francisco, who every night emerge from the depths to slay teenagers with various means of weaponry. The only way to kill them is with water, so the whole bridge thing is a little bit of a questionable real estate choice, but whatever. I told you it doesn't make any sense. There's a samurai neon maniac who's pretty damn cool actually, and maybe like a surgeon, doctor, scientist maniac, I think. Then there's what appears to be a cop. One of them is covered in pure blonde body hair and looks like he could be a distant relative of the mutants from The Hills Have Eyes, but never looks like he's in the right frame. There's a lizard thing. Yeah, I don't really know. Neon Maniacs is weird. That's all there is to it. Swinging in at number 4, Cemetery Man, 1994. Okay, now we can get into the meat of things, where weird horror cinema is actually worth your precious time and investment. Now, I don't say this lightly, but this movie is a hot mess. However, that is exactly what makes it fantastic. Also, as a little side note, I was put onto watching this film last year by some of you top 5 scary fans, so much appreciated for that, and yet still, I'm not entirely sure what to think of it. What I do know is that 1994 Cemetery Man is thoroughly entertaining. It's macabre, it's full of dry humour, it's charming, it's surreal and weird, and it's littered with fragments of a dark philosophy that is alluring throughout the film. But also, this film makes no sense whatsoever. So some people may struggle to get through it, which is a fair enough critique. However, if you do, there's a lot to be enjoyed. For those of you that have already seen the remarkably charming Phantasm series by Don Coscarelli, you will love this film, I'm pretty certain of it. But for those of you that haven't, let me explain. Written and directed by Michel Soavi, an Italian screenwriter and director who had a direct involvement with the masters of giallo, Dario Argento and Lucio Fulci, Cemetery Man tells the tale of a cemetery caretaker named Francesco Dalla Morte, played by the strangely brilliant Rupert Everett, who lives in a rundown, ramshackle house in the middle of a cemetery in a small Italian town. Every now and then, the dead rise up, as they do, and it's Francesco's job to sort them out. However, although that may sound like a pretty intriguing plot, and it is, if you're looking for a narrative that is coherent and makes any sense in the classic Act 1, Act 2, Act 3 manner, then you're in for a strangely delightful disappointment. This film was perhaps the definition of the term offbeat. It digs its many strange burial plots to the beat of its own shovel, and despite all of its flaws, it's oddly beautiful and it's deserving of your attention. Picture the legendary British film 1987's Withnail and I, and then collide it with Tim Burton's most absurd and terrifying fever dreams without all the puppets and stuff, and you've got Cemetery Man. It's great. Next up at number 3, Rubber, 2010.
Oh my God. You see? It's not real. You understand? Everything is fake.
And I'm glad that this film can make it to this list, because whilst it's the literal definition of weird horror cinema, it's also an awesome horror movie. It really is, and if you've ever heard about it, but you've been put off by the sound of a psychic killer tire mowing people down as a bleak and pitiful attempt at B-movie horror, forget that noise. Rubber is fantastic, and whilst this may appear to be the most obvious choice for this list, surprisingly enough, it's actually one of the most highbrow horror films ever made, and it's also one of the most trashy, silly, and lowbrow horror movies ever made. It's like this. Maybe. I don't know. It's kind of confusing, but the premise, well, that's the simple part. A tyre, yes, as in a rubber tyre from a car whose name is Robert, one day wakes up and gains sapience to realise that he is in fact a psychokinetic tyre and has a pretty efficient habit of blowing people's heads up, and thus ensues his tyre rolling rampage across the Californian desert to release his chaotic reign on the poor, unassuming victims. Yeah, it's a psychic slasher movie and the killer is a rubber tyre. A to B horror, right guys? But actually wrong, because although it was met by some harsh criticism, it was in the framing of this film where the true intrigue to it lay. In many ways, Rubber is a horror movie about how dumb horror movies can be, but it never oversteps the mark in that sense, which I think is the main reason why this film is defensible. One of the main criticisms to this film's attempted intellect is that it pokes too much fun out of the subject matter that it uses to make its point, which for many cases I guess is a fair argument. But the reason behind that, although the film explicitly states that it has no reason, is that this film wouldn't have been made if its creators didn't already love those kind of movies. Does that make any sense? It's self-deprecating. Yeah, it mocks a lot of trashy weird horror cinema, but it mocks them out of love. It's like if you're from a small town, it's okay for you and your friends to call it names and complain about how crap it is. But if someone outside of town does that, oh boy, they better watch their mouth. Yeah, that's Rubber. Coming in at number 2, Dead and Buried, 1981.
Gonna make you feel even better.
I ummed and ahed about placing this film on our list, but in the end I think it's the right move for this horror movie. See what I did there? Now, 1981's Dead and Buried is a different kind of weird, because on its initial release, this film was so controversial for its gruesome depictions that it was outright banned as a video nasty in the UK, but by today's standards, this film is pretty damn tame, particularly in some of the film's most explicit moments of gore, but that doesn't exactly matter, because no, it's not in the outdated physical effects where Dead and Buried became a staple of weird horror cinema, but in its narrative, and for a time where horror cinema was still trying to find its footing and figure out just exactly what it wanted to be, Dead and Buried stood out like the sore thumb of a black sheep. And if you delve into the bones of this movie and rummage around in its chest cavity, there are some really strange and disturbing horror motifs. Directed by Gary Sherman, the man responsible for The Fox and the Hound, where I cry every time, Dead and Buried tells a tale of a man named Dan Gillis, played by James Farentino, who returns to his roots as the new sheriff of a small New England town named Potter's Bluff, where he meets back up with some of his old familiar faces. Quickly though, some weird weird stuff starts to turn towards Dan's attention, and in typical Stephen King-esque manner, a small-town New England mystery begins to unfold before our very eyes. In that same line, there are some truly bizarre characters in this film who really steal the show with their nuanced moments of horror. I'll try and not spoil anything, but there is a certain mortician in this film that does some really weird stuff to the point where the typical 80s horror scene wears off a little, and you're not exactly sure whether you should be watching a film more contemporary in tone. In many ways, Dead and Buried plays out like a feature-length episode of The Twilight Zone. In fact, it's very similar in tone to it, ahead of its time and very weird. And finally, coming in at number 1 spot, Lost Highway, 1997.
We've met before, haven't we?
Because the truth of the matter is, we cannot talk about the very weird without addressing the weirdest of the weird, the master of weird horror himself, Mr. David Lynch. To quote a certain teenage paranormal investigator, this film gives me the willies. And some of you may already consider 1997's Lost Highway as Lynch's weirdest film ever made, and really, that's saying something, because we could cover his entire catalogue and already give them the highest honour as the weirdest of horror cinema. This one though, I don't know, I can't quite put my finger on just exactly why Lost Highway stands out amongst Lynch's work, but I guess I'll give it a go. David Lynch has cultivated a very specific genre in his creation. Some would not ever call it horror, although the likes of Eraserhead and Twin Peaks blur the lines between them. But in Lost Highway, I think he managed to sum up just exactly how and why weird fiction can be horrifying. This film is so cold, and I'm not sure if you could ever attribute that adjective to another director. Lost Highway is emotionally empty, but not in the same sense that a film like Hostel or a Serbian film is emotionally empty. There's just nothing there here. And I think that's why this film can only ever really be analysed through a feeling of something, or in this case, a lack of that feeling. In some cases, yeah, this film is difficult to access. You'll probably be frustrated if you aren't in the mood for watching something unlike the rest of horror, but if you really let it sink its teeth in, there are few other films that can carve out the same hollow shape as this one. Written and directed by David Lynch, Lost Highway tells a tale of a jazz musician named Fred Madison, played by Bill Pullman, and his wife Renee, played by Patricia Arquette, who one day find a strange VHS tape left on their porch of an unnerving recording of their own home. As the days pass, more and more of these tapes show up, and that's all I'll say, because you don't need me spoiling one of the weirdest and most bizarre movies ever made. Yeah, you'll get the willies.
Tell him you won't tailgate.
Never!
I won't ever.
Do you not have any car legs? It takes to stop a car at 35 miles an hour!
Well, there we have it, horror fans, our list for the top 5 weirdest horror movies of all time. Part 2. What did you guys think? Do you agree, disagree? Have any more to add to this list? Then let us know your thoughts down in the comment section below, as well as any choice picks of your own. Before we depart from today's video though, if you'd like to continue on with your horror movie recommendation binge, then please make sure to check out our neatly compiled playlist, expertly arranged for your viewing enjoyment. Well, on that note, unfortunately that's all we've got time for in today's video. Cheers for sticking around all the way until the end. If you were a fan of this video, or just top 5 scary videos in general, then please be a dear and hit that thumbs up button, as well as that subscribe bell. I'll be seeing you in the next one. As per usual, I've been your horror host, Jack Finch. You've been watching top 5 scary videos, and until next time, you take it easy.